Michael Stevens had enough money to buy almost anything in the world except the one thing he wanted most, which was hope for his twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, who lay quietly in their special beds unable to move their bodies the way other children could and unable to say a single word even though they were already 2 years old, and doctors kept telling Michael that nothing would ever change and his daughters would always stay this way. Then a new helper named Sarah Martinez came to work at his house as a cleaning lady, and she didn't have any doctor degrees or special training, but she had a secret connection to Michael's wife who had died, and nobody could have guessed what that connection was. What Michael found Sarah doing in the girl's bedroom 3 weeks after she started working would either ruin his family's good name forever or prove that the most amazing miracles don't come from fancy medicine and expensive hospitals but from somewhere much simpler and more powerful. Sarah got down on her knees on the floor, whispered a special promise to his daughters, and after that, everything in their lives changed completely. The huge mansion where Michael lived looked like a castle from a fairy tale, with 15 acres of perfectly cut grass and beautiful gardens outside the city of Boston, with fancy fountains that sparkled when the sun hit them and flowers that bloomed in different colors depending on what time of year it was. Inside the enormous house, everything was so quiet you could hear your own footsteps echoing on the shiny floors, and the only other sounds were medical machines humming quietly in the distance. Michael sat in his office looking at papers and blueprints that he wasn't really paying attention to because his mind was somewhere else. He was 43 years old but looked much older than that, with gray hairs mixed into his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes that made him look tired all the time. His wife Elena had died on the same day their twin daughters were born, and there was a picture of her smiling on his desk, frozen in a happy moment that felt like it happened 1,000,000 years ago even though it had only been 2 years. Some days Michael wondered if maybe he should have been the one to die instead of Elena because she would have been a much better parent than he was turning out to be. Emma and Sophie were his twin daughters, 2 years old now, with their mother's pretty face and their father's dark eyes, but those eyes looked at the world without really seeming to see anything important. The doctors had explained it using big medical words that were hard to understand, but basically there was something wrong with the connections inside the girls' brains, like telephone wires that didn't connect to the right places. The pathways between their brains and their bodies hadn't grown correctly when they were still inside their mother's belly before they were born. The girls couldn't walk, couldn't control their arms and legs the way they wanted to, and they couldn't talk at all, not even one single word. Just some humming sounds or little whimpers once in a while. Michael had spent tons and tons of money trying to fix the problem, like someone trying to fill up an entire ocean using just a bucket. He brought in the smartest brain doctors from famous hospitals, specialists from other countries like Switzerland, and tried experimental treatments from research hospitals that most people had never even heard of. Nothing worked and nothing changed. The twins just lay in their special beds staring up at the ceiling, drooling a little bit, their small bodies trapped like they were in a prison that no amount of money could unlock. Michael avoided going home most days because being there made him too sad. His office downtown became the place where he hid, and he spent his time building hospitals for sick children as a way to make himself feel less guilty. He started something called the Stevens Foundation that built special hospital wings for kids and gave millions of dollars to children's medicine research. People called him a hero and said he was wonderful, but if they only knew the truth, they would understand that every ribbon he cut at a new hospital opening and every award with his name on it felt like a reminder of his biggest failure. He could save thousands of other children with his money, but he couldn't save his own daughters. Mrs. Patterson was the head housekeeper who ran Michael's house, and she was a strict woman in her 60s with sharp features and clothes that were always perfectly neat, and she ran the household like a general runs an army. She knocked loudly on the office door one day and said that the new girl was here for her first day of work. Michael looked up from his papers and asked what new girl she was talking about, and Mrs. Patterson explained in a disapproving voice that she meant the new cleaning lady the agency had sent, a woman named Sarah Martinez who seemed rather young and soft in Mrs. Patterson's opinion. Michael told her to show Sarah what needed to be done around the house and then asked if he would be eating dinner at home that evening. Mrs. Patterson said she would set a place for him, But Michael lied and said he had an important board meeting that night even though he had nothing scheduled at all, because the thought of sitting in that gigantic dining room listening to silence and the sound of his own fork and knife made his chest feel tight and his breathing hard. Sarah Martinez stood at the servants' entrance looking around at the huge house with quiet amazement, because at 29 years old she had cleaned plenty of homes before, but nothing even close to this size or this fancy. This wasn't just a house, it was practically a palace with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling that dripped crystal light over everything and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum that you weren't supposed to touch. Mrs. Patterson appeared holding a clipboard and already looking doubtful about whether Sarah would work out, and she asked if Sarah was the new girl in a tone that suggested she already thought the answer would disappoint her. Sarah said yes, she was Sarah Martinez, and Mrs. Patterson responded that they maintained very high standards in this house and Mr. Stevens expected absolute perfection from everyone who worked for him. She explained that Sarah would be responsible for cleaning the east wing of the house, the main hallways, and the areas where the children spent their time. Sarah nodded and tried to remember everything, and then she asked about the children because Mrs. Patterson had mentioned them. Mrs. Patterson explained in a cold voice that Mr. Stevens had twin daughters who were disabled, and various nurses and therapists handled taking care of them, so Sarah was only responsible for keeping their spaces clean, and she absolutely must not touch any of the medical equipment, and must not interfere with what the specialists were doing. Something about the way Mrs. Patterson said it struck Sarah as strange, like she was talking about broken furniture instead of two little children who deserved love. Sarah asked how old the girls were, and Mrs. Patterson said they were 2 years old and couldn't walk or talk, which was a very sad situation indeed, but she said it in the same tone of voice you might use to describe a broken lamp. Mrs. Patterson led Sarah through hallways that seemed to go on forever, past rooms that Sarah glimpsed through open doorways, including a library with shelves of books reaching all the way to the ceiling, a music room with a grand piano that had dust on it like nobody had played it in a long time, and a sitting room that looked like nobody had ever actually sat in it. Everything was beautiful and expensive, but everything also felt empty and lonely. The nursery was located in the east wing of the mansion behind double doors painted a soft cream color, and when Mrs. Patterson pushed them open, Sarah's breath caught in her throat because the room was so beautiful. 2 cribs stood side by side near tall windows that overlooked the gardens, and the afternoon sunlight coming through the windows painted everything in the room gold. Between the cribs, medical monitors blinked quietly with little lights. There was a changing table, a rocking chair, and shelves full of toys that looked like they had never been played with or touched. In the cribs lay 2 small figures on their backs staring upward at nothing. Mrs. Patterson pointed and said that was Emma on the left and Sophie on the right, and their nurse would be back shortly from her break, so Sarah should just clean around them because they didn't notice much anyway. Sarah barely heard what Mrs. Patterson was saying because she had moved closer to the cribs, and her heart was doing something strange and fluttery in her chest. The twins were absolutely beautiful with dark curly hair spread across their pillows, skin that looked smooth like porcelain, and eyes that seemed enormous in their small faces. Emma's gaze drifted slowly toward the window while Sophie hummed a tuneless little sound, and her tiny fingers twitched against the blanket. Without thinking about what she was doing, Sarah knelt down beside Sophie's crib so she was at eye level with the little girl and said softly that "Hello there, sweet girl," and then she looked at both of them and whispered that they would talk someday, little ladies, even if the whole world said they couldn't. Mrs. Patterson's voice came out sharp and disapproving as she told Sarah that they didn't encourage false hope in this house and Sarah should please stick to her actual duties. Sarah stood up, but something had shifted and changed inside her because she had seen that look before, the way Sophie's eyes had focused directly on her face when she spoke. She had seen that exact same look in her own mother's eyes during the final months of her illness when words had failed her mother completely but understanding remained in those eyes. These girls weren't empty or absent the way everyone seemed to think, Sarah realized. They were trapped inside bodies that wouldn't do what their minds wanted them to do. Over the next few days, Sarah learned how the household worked and what the daily rhythms were like. She learned that Mr. Stevens left the house before the sun came up and returned after dark, that nurses and therapists came and went on strict schedules and performed exercises on the twins with efficient professional movements, but very little warmth or affection, and that the rest of the staff avoided the nursery unless they absolutely had to go in there. She learned that Mr. Stevens's wife Elena had died on the same day the twins were born, and that before her death, Elena had been a pianist who played beautiful music and a painter who created lovely art, someone vibrant and full of life whose memory now haunted the halls of the mansion like a perfumed smell that wouldn't fade away. Sarah started humming while she worked, not really thinking about it at first, just old songs her mother had sung to her when she was little, gospel tunes and lullabies, melodies that felt like comfort wrapped up in sound. She hummed while mopping the hallway outside the nursery, while dusting the bookshelves in the twins' playroom, while folding their tiny clothes, and she started noticing things that other people seemed to miss. She noticed the way Emma's fingers would tap against the crib railing when she hummed certain songs, and the way Sophie's breathing would sync up with the rhythm of the music. They were small things, easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention, but Sarah was paying attention. One afternoon Sarah was in the playroom reorganizing toys when she started humming again, the same melody she had been unconsciously repeating for days without really thinking about it. Behind her, she heard a sound that made her freeze, a soft clapping noise. She turned around quickly and saw that Sophie was sitting in her adaptive chair with her small hands pressed together, clapping once, then twice, and it wasn't random spasms like the doctors always said, it actually matched the beat of Sarah's humming. Then Emma blinked, but not a regular blink, she blinked 2 deliberate times in a row with her eyes locked directly on Sarah's face. Sarah's heart started hammering in her chest like it was trying to escape, and she moved closer to the girls, keeping her movements slow and calm so she wouldn't startle them. She asked Sophie if she could do that again, if she could clap for her one more time, and then Sarah hummed 2 beats of the melody. Sophie's hands came together twice, matching the rhythm perfectly. Sarah breathed the words "Oh my God" because she couldn't believe what she was seeing, and her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and started recording a video. She hummed again and again, and the twins kept responding with Emma blinking and Sophie clapping, and every movement was coordinated and intentional, not random at all. A stern voice from the doorway demanded to know what Sarah was doing, and Sarah jumped because she hadn't heard anyone come in. The lead nurse, Ms. Carson, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest looking very angry. She was a woman in her 50s who wore her authority like a suit of armor. Sarah tried to explain that she was just playing with the girls and they were responding to the music, but Ms. Carson interrupted and said sharply that Sarah was interfering with things that weren't her business. Ms. Carson crossed the room and took Sophie's chair, wheeling it away from Sarah while explaining that Sarah was here to clean and not to play therapist, and these children had very specific care plans developed by actual medical professionals who knew what they were doing. Sarah insisted that the girls were really responding and that she had it on video, but Ms. Carson dismissed it as spasms and coincidental movements, and she said she had been a pediatric nurse for 25 years and knew the difference between real communication and involuntary reflexes. Ms. Carson's tone left absolutely no room for argument, as she warned Sarah that if she caught her disrupting the twins' routine again, she would report Sarah to Mr. Stevens immediately. Sarah's face burned hot with embarrassment, as she said yes ma'am and promised it wouldn't happen again. That evening Sarah was gathering her things to leave for the day when Mr. Stevens appeared in the corridor, and this was the first time they had really been in the same space together even though she had seen him in passing before. He looked exhausted with his expensive suit all rumpled and his tie loosened around his neck. He called her Miss Martinez, and she stopped walking and said yes sir, and he told her that Miss Carson had informed him that Sarah had been overstepping her duties and doing things that weren't part of her job. The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face, and she tried to say that she was sorry but she thought his daughters were trying to communicate, but he cut her off before she could finish. His voice came out flat and emotionless as he said that his daughters were being cared for by trained specialists, and Sarah's job was to clean and not to develop theories, not to interfere with their therapy, and certainly not to give him false hope about conditions that would never change no matter what anyone did. He asked if that was clear, and Sarah's throat felt tight and her eyes burned with tears she was trying to hold back. She wanted to argue with him, to show him the video on her phone, to make him see what she had seen, but the look in his eyes stopped her cold. It wasn't anger in his eyes, it was something much worse than anger. It was defeat, the look of a man who had already given up completely. Sarah said yes, sir, crystal clear, and promised it wouldn't happen again. He walked away and his footsteps echoed down the marble hallway while Sarah stood there feeling smaller and more worthless than she had felt in years. Sarah almost quit her job that night, sitting in her tiny apartment staring at her phone with a resignation letter already half written in her head. What was the point of staying in a place where she wasn't wanted, where her observations were dismissed as delusions and lies? But she couldn't sleep that night. She just kept seeing Sophie's hands clapping in perfect rhythm and Emma's deliberate blinks. And that wasn't just reflex or coincidence. That was real connection between them. Around midnight Sarah returned to the mansion because she couldn't stay away, and the night security guard knew her by now and let her in without asking any questions. The house felt different in the dark, less scary somehow and more honest without all the daytime activity. She found herself wandering through the empty halls not really sure what she was looking for until the music room drew her like a magnet. She had dusted the piano in that room before and admired the framed photographs on the wall showing Elena Stevens at various ages, always at the piano looking happy. There was Elena as a young woman winning a competition, Elena on her wedding day, Elena pregnant and glowing with her hands resting on her belly. Sarah touched the piano keys very gently, not pressing hard enough to make any sound come out, and then she noticed a small drawer in the piano bench and opened it even though she probably shouldn't. Inside the drawer was a leather journal, worn and well-loved, filled with Elena's handwriting in blue ink. Sarah knew she shouldn't read it because it was private and personal, but her hands opened the journal anyway like they had a mind of their own. The entries started during Elena's pregnancy with excitement and fear and hope written all over the pages. And then later entries talked about the diagnosis, about doctors explaining what the tests showed about the twins' condition, about Elena's desperate attempts to find ways to help her babies. Then on a page marked with a dried flower, Sarah found drawings of simple sketches of hands forming different shapes, and next to each drawing were labels in Elena's graceful handwriting that said I love you, hungry, sleep, and mama. Sarah's heart stopped beating for a second as she realized what she was looking at. It was sign language. She flipped through more pages with her hands trembling, and Elena had been teaching herself American Sign Language because she was planning to teach her daughters to communicate with their hands even if they couldn't speak with their mouths, planning to give them a voice no matter what. The very last entry in the journal was dated 2 days before Elena's death, and it said that if the girls couldn't form words with their mouths, they would form words with their hands instead. And Elena's beautiful girls would talk to her somehow because she knew they would, and she would start teaching them the very day they came home from the hospital. But Elena never came home from the hospital, and her plan died with her on that terrible day. Sarah closed the journal very carefully and held it against her chest, and she sat in that dark music room for a long time feeling Elena's presence all around her like a whisper in the air. The woman who had carried these babies inside her, who had refused to give up on them even before they were born, who had seen them as whole complete people with so much potential. When dawn started breaking through the windows and painting everything pink and gold, Sarah made her decision and stood up. She placed the journal back in the bench exactly where she had found it, walked to the nursery where the twins were still sleeping peacefully, and whispered while looking at their beautiful faces that she would finish what their mama had started. And she promised them that whether their daddy wanted her to or not, she would give them the voice their mother had dreamed of giving them. That decision changed absolutely everything, though on the surface nothing looked different to anyone else. Sarah still arrived each morning at 7 o'clock, still wore her plain cleaning uniform, still carried her cleaning supplies through the mansion's endless corridors doing her regular work. But now she moved with a purpose that went way beyond just dusting and mopping floors. She had spent the entire night after finding Elena's journal doing research on her laptop, staying up until 3 in the morning watching video after video about American Sign Language, about alternative communication methods for children with brain conditions, about the connection between rhythm and music and brain development. Her own mother had taught her some of this before she died, back before Sarah had to drop out of nursing school to become a full-time caregiver for her sick mother, and Sarah had learned how to communicate with someone whose stroke had stolen her ability to speak words. Sarah understood what it felt like to have a trapped mind that couldn't express itself. She understood the desperation of wanting to connect with someone you loved when the normal ways of communicating didn't work anymore. Now, during the quiet moments when the nurses took their breaks and the therapists worked in other parts of the house, Sarah began teaching the girls simple signs for basic concepts that would matter to them. She would clean the windows in the nursery, and while the sunlight streamed in through the glass, she would make the sign for sun with her hand, which in American Sign Language meant spreading your fingers out from a closed fist. She would do it over and over while speaking the word aloud at the same time, saying sun while showing them the sign and then pointing to the window to show them what the word meant. At first the twins just stared at her like they always did, but Sarah was patient because she had learned patience during the long months of watching her mother struggle to communicate, celebrating even the smallest victories like a squeeze of the hand or a purposeful blink that proved understanding existed even when expression failed. Sarah signed the word music before she hummed songs, signed the word mama when she found photographs of Elena, signed the word safe when she held the girls during their scheduled repositioning times. The nurses would give her odd looks sometimes, but they were too busy with their medical charts and procedures to really pay attention to what the cleaning lady was doing in between her actual work. 10 days into Sarah's secret lessons, something shifted and changed. Sarah was making the sign for music before beginning her familiar humming when Emma's hand twitched, but not with a random spasm like the doctors always said. It was a movement that tried to copy the gesture Sarah had just made. Emma's fingers attempted to spread out to form the sign even though her muscles wouldn't fully cooperate and do exactly what she wanted. Sarah's breath caught in her throat and she whispered, "Yes, yes, sweet girl, that's music, can you try again?" She made the sign slowly and carefully, and Emma's hand trembled as it tried to mirror the movement, while Sophie's eyes tracked what was happening with intense focus. The girls were learning, but not everyone was blind to what was happening in that nursery. Mr. Hawthorne was the butler who had worked for the Stevens family for 15 years, and he prided himself on knowing everything that occurred under this roof because that was his job. He didn't like mysteries, especially mysteries involving the household help, and he had noticed that the new maid was spending longer than necessary in the nursery, noticed her making strange hand movements through the doorway, noticed the way she held those children differently than the nurses did, with something that looked almost like real love. It made him suspicious because in his long experience working for wealthy families, people didn't do things out of the pure goodness of their hearts. Everyone had an angle they were working. This Sarah Martinez with her soft voice and patient ways must be working some kind of angle, perhaps hoping to make Mr. Stevens fall in love with her so she could work her way into his grieving heart and his very substantial bank account. Mr. Hawthorne began keeping detailed notes with times and dates and observations, building a case to present to Mr. Stevens when the right moment came. The thunderstorm arrived on a Tuesday evening when dark clouds had been building all afternoon. Sarah had worked late that day helping prepare for a charity event happening the following week, and the sky had darkened steadily until by 8 o'clock rain was hammering against the windows like it wanted to break through and get inside. Sarah was finishing her work in the nursery when the first crack of thunder split the sky with a boom so loud it seemed to shake the whole house. The lights flickered on and off for a second, and both twins startled at the sudden noise with Sophie letting out a thin cry of fear. The night nurse had stepped out for her dinner break, which meant Sarah was alone with the girls. Another boom of thunder came, even louder than the first, and Emma began whimpering while Sophie's cry grew more distressed and panicked. Sarah moved quickly across the room, going to Sophie's crib first and lifting the small girl carefully because she had learned how to hold them properly by watching the nurses, supporting their heads and bodies the right way. She murmured, "Sure, sure, it's okay, baby girl," while settling into the rocking chair with Sophie held against her chest. Lightning flashed outside and painted the entire room bright white for just an instant, and Sarah kept saying, "You're safe, sweet girl, you're safe." She began making signs against Sophie's body where the child could feel the movement even if she couldn't see exactly what Sarah was doing, making the sign for safe, which meant crossing one hand over the other at the wrists like a protective shield. Sarah said the word safe out loud while making the sign and told Sophie that she had her, and everything would be okay. Thunder rolled again with another massive boom, and Sophie whimpered against Sarah's chest, but then something completely extraordinary happened that would change everything. The small girl's hands that were resting against Sarah's arms started moving, trembling and uncertain but absolutely deliberate and purposeful, and she crossed one little wrist over the other making the sign for safe. Sophie had signed the word safe all by herself. Sarah's eyes immediately flooded with tears as she gasped out the word yes, yes baby girl, that's exactly right, you signed safe. And then Sophie made a sound that wasn't a cry or a meaningless hum like usual. It was a sound that shaped itself toward an actual word, a soft breathy sound that came out like I am, like she was trying to say mama. The nursery door suddenly opened and Mr. Stevens stood completely frozen in the doorway soaking wet from the rain with his briefcase hanging from one hand. He had come home early because of the storm, some instinct pulling him toward his daughters when the weather got bad, and now he stood there staring at a scene he couldn't quite process or understand. The cleaning lady was sitting in the rocking chair with tears streaming down her face, his daughter was in her arms, and his daughter was making sounds that seemed intentional, sounds that seemed like she was trying to form real words. Michael's voice came out harsh and defensive as he demanded to know what Sarah was doing, and Sarah looked up at him with tears still running down her cheeks and said that Sophie had signed the word safe and she had tried to say mama. Michael told her to stop what she was doing immediately. But Sarah said, please Mr. Stevens, if you would just look and listen. But he cut her off and said louder that she needed to stop gesturing nonsense at his daughter. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took Sophie from Sarah's arms. But the child immediately began crying again now that she wasn't being held by Sarah anymore. Michael accused Sarah of confusing his daughters with her games and making them think they could do things they absolutely couldn't do. But Sarah insisted that Sophie really did do it, and his girls were genuinely trying to talk to him if he would just pay attention. Michael's voice came out quiet but absolutely final as he told Sarah to get out of the room right now. Sarah stood up on shaking legs and wanted desperately to argue, to make him see what had happened, but the grief and anger in his face silenced her completely. She walked toward the door slowly and then paused with her hand on the doorframe and said softly that his wife had known, Elena had known the girls could communicate, and she was planning to teach them before she died. Michael's face went completely pale like all the blood had drained out of it as he asked what Sarah had just said, and Sarah told him that he should ask himself why he was so afraid of hope, asked himself who that fear really served. She left before he could respond or say anything else. The next morning Dr. Harrison came to the mansion for his monthly visit to check on the twins. He was the neurologist who had been following the girls' case since they were born. A kind man in his 60s who had delivered more bad news than good news during his long career as a doctor. He performed his standard examinations on both girls, checking their reflexes and responses and muscle tone, doing all the usual tests. When he finished, he told Michael in the study afterward that everything looked the same as last time, no deterioration, which was good, but no improvement either, and he was sorry that he couldn't give better news. Michael told Dr. Harrison that the cleaning lady claimed the girls were communicating, that she said they were responding to sign language and that one of them had tried to speak an actual word. Dr. Harrison's expression remained carefully neutral and kind as he said that sometimes caregivers became emotionally attached to children and started seeing patterns that weren't really there. It was just wishful thinking and it was completely natural to want things to be different. Michael said that Sarah had seemed very certain about what she saw, but Dr. Harrison explained gently that involuntary mimicry could look like real communication to someone who wasn't trained to know the difference. The girls might move their hands randomly while Sarah was gesturing, and coincidence could look like cause and effect to someone who desperately wanted to see progress. Dr. Harrison leaned forward kindly and said that he knew how much Michael wanted things to be different, and everyone wanted that, but false hope could be more cruel than just accepting reality for what it was. Michael nodded slowly, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. That night Michael called Sarah into his study, and she stood before his big desk with her hands clasped together in front of her, waiting to hear what he would say. He looked tired and somehow older than he had looked just yesterday. Michael told Sarah that Dr. Harrison had been there today, and Sarah said yes, sir, she knew. Michael explained that Dr. Harrison had said what Sarah thought she was seeing was likely just random movement and coincidence, nothing more than that. His voice was gentle but firm as he said that he appreciated Sarah's compassion, he truly did, but he needed her to stop the sign language games because they weren't helping anyone. Sarah asked with respect how he could know they weren't helping if he had barely even tried to see if they worked, and Michael's jaw tightened as he said it was because every single expert he had consulted over 2 years had told him exactly the same thing. His daughters had severe permanent limitations that would never change, and filling his head with fantasies about them learning sign language or saying words served absolutely no purpose except to make the painful truth even more painful to bear. Sarah asked what if the truth was actually different than what those experts thought, and Michael stood up and walked to the window with his back to her. He said that if the experts were wrong, his daughters would have shown some kind of improvement over the past 2 years, but they hadn't shown any improvement at all. He told Sarah that he had accepted what was real, and he suggested that she do the same thing and accept it too. His voice was firm as he said no more signing, no more special attention beyond what was required for her job, and she should do her job exactly as she was hired to do it, or he would need to find someone else who would follow his instructions. Sarah left that meeting with her throat feeling tight, and her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall until she was alone. She wanted to shake Michael Stevens and make him see what he was throwing away by being so stubborn and afraid, but at the same time she understood his fear too because she had seen it in families at the hospital where she used to work, had seen it in her own reflection in the mirror when her mother was dying. Hope was absolutely terrifying because hope could break your heart worse than grief ever could, and Michael had already had his heart broken once when his wife died. That night Sarah couldn't stay away from the mansion even though she knew she should. After the entire household was asleep, she crept back through the dark halls moving silently like a ghost, and she made her way to the nursery. She settled on the floor between the 2 cribs, close enough to see the twins' sleeping faces in the soft glow of the nightlight. She whispered that she wouldn't give up on them no matter what their father said, and she promised them that out loud. Sarah began signing and humming softly at the same time, singing an old spiritual song that her mother had sung to her when she was little, a song about holding on and not giving up even when things seemed impossible. She had sung it to her mother in those final terrible weeks when words had completely failed but music still somehow reached through the fog. The melody drifted through the quiet nursery, and Sarah's hands moved through the signs she had been teaching the girls, signs for sun and music and mama and safe. Sophie's eyes opened first in the dim light, and then Emma's eyes opened too, and in that gentle glow both twins looked at Sarah with an awareness that seemed impossible according to everything the doctors said. And then in a moment that Sarah would remember for the rest of her entire life, Sophie started humming, but not her usual tuneless meaningless sound. She hummed the exact melody that Sarah was singing with the exact tune and the exact rhythm. Sarah's hands went completely still as she breathed "Oh my God," and then Emma's mouth opened and a sound emerged that was thin and shaky but definitely shaped like a word. The sound came out like Emma, trying so hard to say mama. Sarah whispered for Emma to say it again, to please try one more time, sweetheart, and Emma's little mouth worked hard as the sound came out clearer this time, mama. The word hung in the air between them like an actual miracle had just happened. Sarah grabbed her phone with hands that were shaking so badly she could barely hold it, and she hit the record button. She hummed again and Sophie echoed her perfectly. She made the sign for mama and Emma's hands twitched and struggled, trying so hard to copy the gesture. Sarah recorded all of it with tears streaming down her face and dripping off her chin. But even as she captured this impossible moment on video, fear crept into her heart like ice water. What would happen when Michael saw this? Would he accuse her of tricks and lies, of somehow manipulating his daughters to make it look like progress when it wasn't real? Would he fire her before the girls could show him what they were becoming, and what they could do? She saved the video carefully but didn't send it to anyone, not yet, because the evidence felt too precious and too fragile to share. In the darkness of that nursery, holding her phone with its impossible proof, Sarah made a choice and a promise. She would continue the lessons in secret no matter what Michael had said. Every single night after the house went to sleep, she would return to this room and speak to these girls in the language their mother had wanted to teach them. If Michael Stevens wouldn't give his own daughters a chance, then Sarah would give them that chance herself. What Sarah didn't know was that across the hall in his own bedroom, Michael lay wide awake in the darkness. He had heard humming, soft but distinct, drifting through the walls, and beneath the humming he heard other sounds that he didn't want to acknowledge or admit were real. Sounds that might have been his daughters' voices trying to form words they weren't supposed to be able to say. He pulled a pillow over his head trying to block it all out, because if what he was hearing was actually real, it meant he had been completely wrong about everything. It meant he had given up when he shouldn't have given up. It meant the cleaning lady he had dismissed and scolded had seen something precious in his daughters that he had been too broken and afraid to see himself. And that truth was more painful than any thunderstorm could ever be. The changes started coming slowly at first, and then they came all at once like water breaking through a dam. Within 3 weeks of Sarah's secret nighttime lessons, the mansion began to sound different in ways that made the staff pause in their work and look at each other with uncertain, confused expressions on their faces. The silence that had pressed against the walls for 2 solid years started cracking and breaking apart, letting in small noises that seemed impossible. Laughter came first, dry and raspy like wind blowing through old leaves, but unmistakably real laughter from actual children. It happened for the first time on a Tuesday morning when one of the day nurses was changing Emma's position in her crib and accidentally dropped a rubber toy. The toy bounced twice on the floor, making a silly squeaking sound, and Emma's mouth opened wide as a laugh came tumbling out. The laugh was brief and broken sounding, but it was absolutely real and genuine. The nurse stood completely frozen with the toy forgotten in her hand, unable to believe what she had just heard. By that same afternoon, word had spread through the entire household like wildfire. The twins were making sounds, not just random humming anymore like they used to, but actual responses to things happening around them. When music played on the speaker in the therapy room, Sophie would clap her hands together, off rhythm and clumsy but completely purposeful and intentional. When the physical therapist worked with Emma, the girl would tap her fingers against the soft mat in patterns that almost seemed deliberate and meaningful. And sometimes when no one was looking directly at them or paying close attention, the twins would actually crawl, not well and not very far, but they moved their bodies towards sounds that interested them, like the jingle of keys or the scrape of a chair or the distant notes of the piano that nobody had played since Elena died. The household staff noticed these changes, but fear kept most of them quiet and unwilling to talk about it openly. Fear of being wrong about what they were seeing, fear of false hope that might get crushed, fear of how Mr. Stevens might react if they mentioned it to him. Only Betty the cook, an older woman with gray hair and a kind heart, dared to speak about it out loud. She said one afternoon in the kitchen that those babies were waking up, and whatever was happening, something powerful was bringing them back to life. But not everyone saw these changes as a good thing or a blessing. Some of the staff grew resentful and suspicious, and whispered conversations started happening in dark corners and behind closed doors where nobody else could hear. Sarah became the main focus of their suspicion and gossip. One maid muttered to another that Sarah was doing something weird, something that wasn't natural. Another staff member suggested that maybe Sarah was after Mr. Stevens's money, playing a long game to make herself seem special so the boss would notice her, and maybe even fall in love with her. The ugly rumors spread like mold growing in dark, damp places, and Sarah could feel their weight pressing down on her even when no one spoke their suspicions directly to her face. She would catch looks from other staff members that were cold and calculating and full of judgment. She would hear conversations that stopped dead the instant she entered a room. Mr. Hawthorne watched her constantly now with disapproval carved into every single line of his stern face. Sarah said nothing about any of it, and just let them think whatever they wanted to think, because all that truly mattered were Emma and Sophie and helping them find their voices. The big breakthrough moment came when Michael was showing a potential investor through the mansion's expensive art collection. They were walking through the East Gallery looking at paintings when sounds drifted from the nearby playroom, sounds of music and children's voices attempting to sing along to the melody. The investor, a man named Thomas Brennan, paused in the hallway and said with surprise that he didn't know Michael had other children living in the house. Michael said shortly that he didn't have other children, but Thomas pointed out that he could definitely hear children's voices coming from that room. Michael walked quickly toward the playroom with Thomas following close behind, and when Michael opened the door, the scene inside stopped him absolutely cold, and made his heart skip several beats. Sarah sat on the floor with both twins near her, and a children's video was playing on a tablet showing bright colors and simple songs. The girls were responding to the video in ways that seemed completely impossible. Emma's mouth was moving as she tried to form the words of the song, and Sophie's hands were clapping in rhythm with the music. When Sarah made sign language gestures along with the video, both twins attempted to copy her movements with their own small hands. Thomas breathed the word remarkable and said that he had thought Michael's daughters were severely disabled, but Michael's voice came out strangled as he insisted that they were disabled. Thomas said that they didn't look disabled to him at all. They looked like they were learning and growing just like any other children. Sarah finally noticed Michael and Thomas standing in the doorway watching them, and she stood up quickly, suddenly very aware of how this whole situation must look to them. Michael's face had gone deathly pale, and his jaw was clenched tight as he told Sarah to come to his office immediately. He turned to Thomas with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes and apologized, saying there was something urgent he needed to take care of, and his assistant would show Thomas out of the house. 5 minutes later, Sarah stood in front of Michael's big desk while he paced back and forth like a caged wild animal. He demanded to know what she had been doing, and Sarah tried to explain that she was teaching the girls, but he interrupted her and said with his voice rising that he had told her to stop. Sarah said that the girls were genuinely learning and if he would just watch them carefully he would see it was real, but Michael insisted loudly that it was all coincidence and reflexes and nothing more. Sarah's next words came out before she could stop them or think about whether she should say them, and she told him that he was lying to himself. Michael knew exactly what he had just seen in that playroom. He knew it was real and not coincidence. Michael's hand slammed down hard on his desk, making a loud bang as he said that Sarah was just staff, just a cleaning lady in his house, and she didn't get to tell him what he knew about his own daughters. Sarah shot back that maybe he didn't know his daughters at all if he refused to see what was right in front of his face. The silence stretched between them, dangerous and electric like lightning about to strike. Michael's face flushed red with anger, and something else mixed in, something that looked a whole lot like fear. He said the words slowly and clearly, telling Sarah to clean out her things because she was fired effective immediately. Sarah's stomach dropped down to her feet as she said, "Please, Mr. Stevens," but he cut her off and said he would not have his daughters used as experiments by someone with no medical training and delusions of grandeur. He told her to get out of his house right now. Sarah wanted desperately to argue, to fight, to make him see the truth, but the look in his eyes told her it would be completely useless to try. He had made his choice, and it was the same choice he had been making every single day since his daughters were born, the choice to protect himself from hope because hope was too painful and too scary. Upstairs in the nursery, as if somehow sensing that something was very wrong, the twins began to cry with heartbroken wails that echoed through the halls. That same evening, Dr. Harrison received an urgent phone call from Michael, who sounded upset and frantic. When the doctor arrived at the mansion, Michael led him directly to the nursery where the twins lay in their cribs with their faces blotchy and red from crying so much. Michael demanded that Dr. Harrison examine them and tell him exactly what he saw. Dr. Harrison performed his usual tests like he always did, but this time something in his expression shifted and changed as he worked. He watched carefully as Sophie tracked a toy with her eyes following its movement. He observed as Emma's fingers gripped his hand when he offered it to her, and he listened closely to the sounds they made, which weren't quite words yet but definitely weren't random either. When they returned to Michael's study to talk privately, the doctor's face looked troubled and concerned. Dr. Harrison said that he needed to be completely honest with Michael about something important. He explained that something had definitely changed in the girls. Michael asked what he meant by changed and how, and Dr. Harrison said their motor responses were different and their neural engagement was different, and he was seeing coordinated movements that absolutely were not there 3 months ago when he had last examined them. He paused and chose his words very carefully before continuing, explaining that their latest brain scans showed neuronal activity in areas of their brains that everyone had assumed were dormant and not working. Something was triggering new pathways to form in their brains, pathways that shouldn't be forming according to everything they knew. Michael sat down heavily in his chair and said it was the cleaning lady. She had been teaching them sign language against his direct orders. Dr. Harrison asked if it had been working, and Michael said he honestly didn't know anymore. He couldn't tell what was real and what he was just imagining because he wanted it to be real so badly. Dr. Harrison leaned forward with an intense expression and said that Michael needed to listen carefully to what he was about to say. Whether it was the sign language or something else entirely, if there was a trigger for neural development in these girls, they needed to identify it and continue it immediately. This kind of brain rewiring, especially at their young age, wasn't impossible, but it was extremely rare and precious. If someone had found a way to reach these children and wake up their brains, she deserved credit, not dismissal. Michael protested that Sarah was just a cleaning lady with no credentials or formal training, but Dr. Harrison said that neither did the parents who first developed music therapy for children with autism, and neither did the mother who invented special weighted blankets for premature babies. The doctor's voice was gentle but absolutely firm as he explained that sometimes the best medicine wasn't what doctors learned in fancy medical schools, it was what people learned from simply paying attention and caring deeply. After Dr. Harrison left, Michael climbed the stairs slowly to the nursery, feeling like his legs were made of lead. The night nurse had gotten the twins settled down, but they were still restless and making small distressed sounds like sad little birds. Michael stood in the doorway for a long time just watching them in the dim light, and he asked himself when was the last time he had really looked at them, not at their limitations or what they represented about his failures, but at them as his actual daughters who were real complete people. Emma had Elena's delicate nose, and Sophie had his own stubborn chin. Two complete human beings trapped in bodies that didn't work right, at least not until recently, not until Sarah had arrived. Michael moved closer to the cribs and Emma's eyes found him immediately, and something in her expression broke his heart into a million pieces because it was awareness and recognition. This was his daughter knowing her father, seeing him and understanding who he was even if she couldn't say his name out loud. He tried desperately to remember what Sarah had been doing with her hands, those sign language movements, and his own hands felt clumsy and stupid as he attempted to form a gesture even though he didn't know what it meant. But Sophie's eyes went wide when she saw him trying, and her small hands came up trembling as she tried to copy his movement. And then a sound emerged from her tiny throat that made Michael's knees nearly give out from under him. The sound came out clear as a bell, "Dida." Michael grabbed the edge of the crib to steady himself because he thought he might actually fall down. He asked Sophie what she had just said, and she said it again even clearer this time, "Dida," and it was definitely a real word and definitely intentional. Emma's mouth opened next and she said "Dida" too, and the sound they made was imperfect and strained, but it was absolutely language. It was his children calling for him, trying to talk to their father. Michael realized with horror washing over him that he had been so busy protecting himself from disappointment and pain that he had almost missed the miracle happening right in front of his eyes. He picked up his phone with hands that were shaking violently and found Sarah's number and dialed. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, and her voice sounded weary and sad when she said hello. Michael asked where she was, and Sarah said that she was packing her things because he had fired her that afternoon. Michael's words tumbled out fast as he told her not to pack, to come back to the mansion right away please. Sarah asked why with confusion in her voice, and Michael explained that the girls had just said "Dida," and he didn't know what he was supposed to do or how to help them, but she did know and she could help them. He begged her to please come back. There was silence on the other end of the phone line for what felt like forever, and then Sarah said quietly that she would be there in 20 minutes. When Sarah arrived at the mansion, Michael was still sitting on the floor of the nursery between the 2 cribs, and she had never seen him look like this before, so vulnerable and lost and broken open. He said simply that she should show him everything she had been doing with the girls, show him all of it from the beginning. The very next morning Michael called an emergency meeting with his board of directors, and 8 men and 2 women sat around the polished conference table in his downtown office, all of them wearing expressions of mild concern because Michael rarely called emergency meetings unless something major was happening. Philip Garrett, the board chairman, spoke first and asked what this was about because Michael's assistant had said it was urgent. Michael stood at the head of the table feeling like he was about to jump off the edge of a cliff, and he said that he needed to address some rumors before they became serious problems. He explained that they might have heard stories about his daughters, about improvements in their condition. The board members looked at each other, and one woman named Janet Palmer, who was the CFO, admitted that they had heard whispers, something about a miracle cleaning lady. The phrase made Michael wince because it sounded so dramatic, and he explained that her name was Sarah Martinez and she had been working with his daughters using alternative communication methods like sign language and music therapy and emotional engagement. He said the results had been absolutely remarkable. Philip asked carefully how remarkable Michael meant, and Michael explained that the girls were talking or beginning to talk, they were moving purposefully, they were engaging with the world in ways that every doctor had said would never be possible. The board members exchanged worried glances with each other, and Philip cleared his throat and said that was wonderful news truly, but he wasn't sure why this required an emergency meeting. Michael said it was because people were talking, and when people talked about him they also talked about the company. He explained that Stevens Medical Technologies was built on credibility, on cutting-edge science and proven results. But now the story spreading everywhere was that his disabled daughters were being healed by a domestic worker with no medical degree while the company's own specialists stood by helplessly watching. The realization spread across all their faces like a wave. Janet spoke first and said it made the company look incompetent, and a man named Marcus Webb, who was head of public relations, said it was actually worse than that. It made them look like frauds. He explained that if a cleaning lady could achieve results that their trained neurologists couldn't achieve, what did that say about the expensive medical technology they were selling to hospitals all over the world? Michael countered that maybe it said they had been approaching disability all wrong, and maybe there was real value in methods they had previously dismissed as unscientific. Philip's expression hardened as he said that Michael needed to understand that he was emotionally invested because these were his children, but he had to think about the optics of the situation. Their investors and partners needed to believe in their scientific approach, and this story was undermining everything the company stood for. Michael said that his daughters' lives were not about optics, but Philip leaned forward and said firmly that Michael's company absolutely was about optics. He explained that they had a quarterly earnings call in 3 days, and their stock price was already volatile. And if this story continued to spread and people started questioning their expertise, they could lose millions or possibly even billions of dollars. Marcus pulled out his tablet and showed headlines from gossip websites and local news sites. The headlines read things like "Billionaire'S miracle babies," and "Cleaning lady succeeds where $1 million medicine failed," and "Love cures what science couldn't." Marcus said that every single one of these headlines made Stevens Medical look like a complete joke. Michael asked what exactly they were suggesting he do, and Janet said they should distance themselves from the narrative immediately. She suggested sending the girls to that fancy facility in Switzerland that specialized in neurological rehabilitation, and let proper medical professionals handle their care in a controlled environment away from gossip and media speculation. Michael said with disbelief that they wanted him to send his 2-year-old daughters to another country far away, and Philip said carefully that they were suggesting Michael protect both his family and his company by ensuring his daughters received the best possible care in a setting that could be properly documented and studied, away from all the gossip and media chaos. Michael looked around the table at these people he had worked with for years, and they weren't cruel people. They were just practical people who saw a problem and wanted to fix it the way they fixed everything, with money and strategy and control. Michael said he would think about their suggestion, but when he returned home that afternoon and heard his daughter's laughter floating down the stairs, he knew exactly what his answer would be. The board could think whatever they wanted to think. He had spent 2 years letting other people tell him what was best for Emma and Sophie, and he was completely done with that. He found Sarah in the playroom with both girls on the floor around her, and Sophie was using her hands to sign the word more while Emma attempted to stack soft blocks one on top of another. When the girls saw their father in the doorway, both their faces lit up with huge smiles. Sophie called out in her thin but clear voice, and Emma added Pa as her version of Papa. Michael's throat got tight with emotion, and he had missed his company's entire afternoon board meeting session to come home early for this, to watch his daughters be truly alive. That evening Michael told Sarah about the board's suggestion while they sat in the library and the girls napped upstairs. He watched her face carefully as he explained about Switzerland, about the fancy facility there, about all the pressure to move the girls far away. Sarah asked quietly what Michael wanted to do, and he laughed bitterly, and said he wanted to tell the board to go to hell. He explained it wasn't that simple though, because the company employed 3,000 people, and if they lost investor confidence and the stock crashed, those were real jobs and real families who would be hurt. Sarah said that so he was choosing the company over his daughters, and Michael said that wasn't fair. Sarah's eyes met his directly as she said that actually it was completely fair. She reminded him that he had built a medical empire while his babies lay in cribs thinking nobody loved them enough to try helping them. The words hit Michael like a physical punch to the stomach, and he said that he did love Emma and Sophie. Sarah told him then to show them that love, not with money or facilities or specialists, but show them by staying with them, by learning their language, by being brave enough to hope even when hope was absolutely terrifying. She stood up and headed for the door, but then she paused and turned back. She told Michael that his wife had left him a message in her journal. Elena had written that the girls would speak when they were loved without conditions, which meant accepting them even if all the progress stopped tomorrow, even if they never got any better than they were right at that moment. Sarah asked if Michael could do that, could he love them exactly as they were? After Sarah left the library, Michael sat alone in the silence for a long time thinking about Elena and about the last conversation they had before she went into the hospital to have the babies. Elena had been scared because she knew the risks and knew about the twins' diagnosis, but she had smiled at him and made him promise that whatever happened, he would love those babies exactly as they were. Michael had promised Elena that he would, and then he had spent 2 solid years breaking that promise every single day. The next morning Michael called Philip Garrett and told him directly that he was not sending the girls to Switzerland. Philip said that Michael needed to be reasonable, but Michael said he was keeping his daughters here with him and with Sarah, and whatever happened to the stock price would just have to happen. Philip said that Michael was making a terrible mistake, and Michael said that maybe he was, but it was his mistake to make. He hung up the phone before Philip could argue anymore, and then he went upstairs and asked Sarah to teach him all the signs she had been using with the girls. Michael spent the rest of that morning sitting on the floor with his daughters, learning how to say I love you with his hands instead of just his voice. But that same afternoon everything changed again when a nurse came running down the stairs with her face pale with panic, shouting that it was Sophie and she was having a seizure. The ambulance arrived within minutes with sirens wailing, and Michael rode with Sophie in the back while Sarah stayed behind with Emma, both of them watching the emergency vehicle disappear down the long driveway with its lights flashing red and blue. At the hospital doctors swarmed around Sophie hooking her up to machines, and tests were ordered and scans were completed. Finally Dr. Harrison emerged from the examination room with news about what had happened. He explained that the seizure had been caused by overstimulation, and Sophie's brain was rewiring itself rapidly and creating new pathways, but the process was putting enormous stress on her nervous system. It was like trying to rebuild a bridge while traffic was still crossing it at the same time. Michael asked if Sophie would be okay, and Dr. Harrison said they had stabilized her, but Michael needed to seriously consider slowing down the therapy because the progress she was making was remarkable, but it was also dangerous. Sophie's brain needed time to adjust to all the changes happening. Back at home Sarah sat in the dark nursery with Emma while Sophie spent the night under observation at the hospital, and Sarah felt like this was all her fault, like she had pushed too hard and wanted too much, and now one of these precious girls was paying the price for her mistakes. When Michael returned near midnight, he found Sarah sitting there crying silently, and she whispered that this was all her fault, and she should have been more careful. Michael sat down beside her and said, "No, this is what trying looks like, and sometimes it's messy and scary, but it's still better than giving up." Sarah asked if he really believed that, and Michael said that if something happened to Sophie then they would face it together. He took Sarah's hand and the gesture surprised both of them. He explained that Dr. Harrison had said the therapy should continue but just more slowly, and Sarah hadn't hurt Sophie at all, she had woken her up, and sometimes waking up was painful but it was still better than staying asleep forever. They sat together in the dim nursery with their hands clasped until dawn broke through the windows painting everything gold, and Sophie came home later that morning sleeping peacefully in her father's arms. The crisis had passed, but it had changed something fundamental between Michael and Sarah, and a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. They weren't just employer and employee anymore, they were two people fighting for exactly the same cause, bound together by hope and fear mixed in equal measure. The board's pressure continued with phone calls and emails, but Michael stopped taking their calls and stopped reading their messages. His daughters had said their first words, they had taken their first crawling steps, they had laughed and cried and responded to love in ways that proved they had been there all along just waiting for someone to listen carefully. And if the world wanted to call it a miracle, then let them call it whatever they wanted. Michael had finally learned that some miracles didn't come from medicine or money or fancy technology. Some miracles came from a woman brave enough to kneel on a floor and promise two forgotten girls that they would talk someday. That promise was being kept now, one sign at a time, one sound at a time, one breakthrough at a time. 1 year later the mansion looked completely different than it had before, and what had been silent halls now echoed with children's laughter all day long. What had been empty and used rooms now served as therapy spaces filled with small chairs and colorful mats, and special equipment designed for growing bodies that were learning to move. The Elena Grace Foundation had transformed Michael's home into a demonstration center where 3 days every week, families would visit, parents of children with brain conditions, therapists wanting to learn the new methods, researchers studying the combination of emotional connection and structured therapy that had helped Emma and Sophie so much. Sarah stood in the main therapy room leading a training session for 15 nurses who had traveled from all over the country to learn from her. She wore professional clothes now instead of a cleaning uniform, and her hair was pulled back in a neat style, and confidence had replaced all the uncertainty that had once shadowed every movement she made. She explained to the nurses that the key wasn't forcing progress through strict therapy. The key was creating space for real connection. She demonstrated a sign with a young boy who had been born with a condition called cerebral palsy, and she said that if a child felt truly seen and understood, they would try harder than any amount of forced therapy could ever push them. The nurses took notes carefully and some recorded videos on their phones, and one raised her hand with a question about music integration, and Sarah answered easily, drawing on all the knowledge she had gained from a year of formal study. Michael had insisted that Sarah complete her nursing degree properly this time, and she had graduated 3 months ago at the top of her entire class. Through the window Michael stood watching Sarah teach, and he had stepped back from most public-facing work, content to handle the foundation's business side while Sarah became its heart and soul. She was a natural-born teacher, patient and clear, able to turn complex concepts into simple truths that anyone could understand. Betty the cook appeared beside Michael with a cup of coffee and said that Sarah was really something special, and Michael agreed and said yes, she definitely was. Betty asked with a knowing smile if Michael was planning to make it official soon, and Michael smiled and said yes, very soon. In the garden outside, Emma and Sophie played under the watchful supervision of their regular therapist, and at 3.5 years old they were small for their age but absolutely thriving. Emma could walk short distances without any assistance now, though she still used a walker for longer trips through the house. Sophie's speech had improved dramatically, and she could string together 5 or 6 words at a time, and her sign language was clear and confident. The girls played a game of their own invention that was part tag and part conversation, where Emma would sign something and Sophie would respond with spoken words, and then they would collapse into giggles together. To a stranger visiting the house they might seem a bit delayed compared to typical children their age, but to anyone who had known them a year ago, when they couldn't move or speak at all, they were absolute miracles walking and talking. Dr. Harrison visited that afternoon for the twins' quarterly evaluation, and the neurologist who had once dismissed Sarah's methods now called her every few months for advice on other patients he was treating. He examined both girls thoroughly and tested their responses and measured all their progress. Afterward he met with Michael and Sarah in the study and said the word remarkable, explaining that the girls' latest brain scans showed continued neuronal development, and the pathways were strengthening instead of weakening. He said that at this rate Emma might not need her walker at all by age 5, and Sophie's speech centers were activating in ways they had never seen in cases like hers before. Sarah asked what had changed his mind about these methods, and Dr. Harrison smiled and admitted that watching the methods work when everything he had learned in medical school said they shouldn't work had changed his mind. He said that medical school taught doctors about the body, but nobody taught them about the incredible power of being truly loved, and that had been his blind spot. He gathered his files and said that the paper they were publishing next month should help change some minds in the medical community because the Foundation's data was absolutely compelling. After Dr. Harrison left, Michael and Sarah stood at the window watching the girls play in the garden, and they stood close together with the space between them humming with possibilities. Michael said suddenly that he had something for Sarah, and he led her to the music room where the piano sat in warm afternoon light. On the piano's surface lay a small velvet box, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Michael said it wasn't what she was thinking, not yet anyway, and he opened the box to reveal not a ring but an old brass key worn smooth with age. He explained that this was Elena's key to her mother's house in Vermont, a little cottage on a lake where Elena had always said she would take the girls someday to teach them to swim and pick berries and just be normal children. Michael pressed the key into Sarah's palm and said it was hers now, theirs actually, and he thought maybe that summer they could take the girls there, all of them together as a family. The word family settled between them warm and true, and they were a family now, complicated and unconventional, born from tragedy and built on hope, but absolutely real. Sarah said softly that she would like that very much. That evening they hosted a charity gala at the mansion with 500 guests filling the grounds, all dressed in elegant clothes and drinking champagne under string lights. The Foundation had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. They had opened 3 satellite centers in other cities, trained over 200 therapists, and helped more than 50 families see real improvement in their children. But the heart of everything remained right there in that house, with 2 little girls who had been written off as hopeless. As dinner concluded, Michael took the microphone and the crowd quieted down, sensing something important was about to happen. Michael thanked everyone for being there that night, for supporting the Elena Grace Foundation and for believing that every single child deserved a chance. He paused and found Sarah in the crowd, and he said that a year ago he had stood at another microphone and told everyone about 2 women who had changed everything, his wife Elena and Sarah's mother Margaret. Women who saw potential where others saw only limitation. Sarah moved through the crowd toward Michael, sensing that he needed her beside him. Michael gestured toward the house and asked Emma and Sophie to please come out, and the crowd murmured with anticipation because most of them had only seen pictures and heard stories. The double doors opened and 2 little girls emerged holding hands, Emma wearing a red dress and Sophie wearing blue. They walked carefully down the steps, their walking uneven but determined, their faces bright with excitement. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and some people were openly crying because these children who weren't supposed to walk or talk or laugh were standing in front of 500 people without any fear at all. Michael knelt down, bringing himself to their level, and Sarah did the same. The girls looked at each other with some silent communication passing between them, and then Sophie stepped forward and took the microphone her father offered. Her voice came out high and clear, the words careful but confident as she said, "Hi, I'm Sophie, this is Emma, and we want to say thank you." More applause filled the air, but Sophie held up her small hand in a gesture she had learned from watching Sarah teach, and the crowd quieted immediately. Sophie said that lots of people had told them they couldn't talk or walk or be like other kids, and she glanced at Sarah for reassurance and got an encouraging nod. Sophie continued and said that, but Sarah told us we could, and Daddy believed her, and now we can. Emma stepped forward next, signing as she spoke with her voice quieter but just as clear, saying that love is the best medicine, and that's what Sarah always says, and she's right. Together the twins signed and spoke their final sentence, saying thank you for helping other kids just like us. The applause was absolutely deafening, and Michael pulled both girls into his arms, holding them close. Sarah wrapped her arms around all three of them, and cameras flashed everywhere capturing the perfect moment. Later that night, after all the guests had left, and the girls were sound asleep, Michael and Sarah sat on the mansion steps looking up at the stars, the same steps where they had stood that first morning after the storm when everything had seemed completely impossible. Sarah said quietly that Elena would be proud, and Michael said that Sarah's mother would be proud too. Michael took Sarah's hand and laced their fingers together, and he said he had been thinking about that key, about Vermont, about taking the girls there this summer. Sarah reminded him they had already talked about that, and Michael said he knew, but he had been thinking about something else too, about what it would mean to make this official, not just the foundation but them, their relationship. Sarah's heart hammered hard in her chest, and Michael said quickly that he wasn't asking her to marry him, not tonight and not yet, but he was telling her that he wanted to, that he loved her, that somewhere between her teaching his daughters to sign and him learning to listen, he had fallen completely and totally in love with her. His thumb traced gentle circles on her hand as he said that she didn't have to answer right now, he just needed her to know how he felt. Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks as she said that she loved him too, and she thought she had for a while now, but she had been scared. Michael asked what she had been scared of, and Sarah said scared that he only saw her as the girl's caretaker, scared that she was reading too much into everything. Michael kissed her then, soft and certain, and when they pulled apart they were both crying and laughing at the same time. Sarah asked, "So are we really doing this?" And Michael said they were already doing it, they were just making it official now. He stood up and pulled her to her feet and said he wanted to show her something. He led Sarah to the nursery where both girls slept peacefully with moonlight painting their faces silver, making them look like little angels. Michael opened the drawer of the changing table and pulled out Elena's small leather journal, and he said he had found it again last week and reread the whole thing. He turned to a page marked with a ribbon and told Sarah to listen. He read aloud from Elena's journal about a dream she had where she was watching the girls playing in a garden and they were calling for someone, not Elena but another woman who was laughing with them and teaching them something with her hands. Elena had written that she felt so happy and peaceful in the dream because she knew the girls would be loved even if Elena couldn't be there to love them herself. Michael pointed out that Elena had dated that entry just 2 weeks before she died. Sarah's hand covered her mouth as she realized what this meant, and she said that Elena had somehow seen her in that dream. Michael said maybe Elena really had seen the future, or maybe she just knew deep in her heart that love always finds a way. He closed the journal gently and said that either way, he thought Elena would approve of Sarah, of them, of everything they were building together. They stood side by side watching Emma and Sophie sleep, two people who had started as employer and employee and had become something infinitely more precious, partners and co-parents, and soon God-willing husband and wife. As they turned to leave the nursery, Sophie stirred and mumbled in her sleep, saying "Ma" and "Dada" and "love you." The words were slurred with sleep but absolutely clear and real. Emma echoed her sister without even waking up, saying "love you too." Michael and Sarah left the nursery hand in hand, closing the door softly behind them, and tomorrow the world would continue turning with the foundation continuing to grow and more families coming to seek hope and more children finding their voices. But tonight in this mansion that had once echoed with nothing but silence, a family slept peacefully together. 2 little girls who had been told they would never speak had thanked 500 people in their own words. A father who had almost given up completely had learned to hope again. And a woman who had walked through those doors as a simple cleaning lady had become the mother these children desperately needed. The miracle wasn't that Emma and Sophie had learned to walk and talk, the real miracle was that they had always been whole and complete, just waiting for someone to see them clearly. The miracle was that love in its purest form could heal wounds that medicine never touched. The miracle was that sometimes in the darkest moments, God sends exactly who you need, not who you expect or who makes sense, but who your heart has been waiting for all along. And in a house that had once held only grief and sadness, that miracle was now celebrated every single day in laughter, in small hands forming signs, in voices that weren't supposed to exist saying the most important words of all, I love you too, we're family. This is the end of silence, and the beginning of absolutely everything.